I want to go back to that Oscar Wilde quote that I opened with about how it is what you read when you don't have to that determines what you will be when you can't help it. Because this is very much tied to our spiritual reading. It's easy to go to church and like listen to the gospel and maybe hear the same gospel and be like, oh, I know this story, like no big deal. Like he's gonna come back, the lost son, he's gonna get forgiven, okay. Like we've heard it a bunch of times. It's easy to even like sit in church and just kind of let the Psalms like wash over you. Like you've heard them so many times, you could practically recite it while thinking about something else. But it's in that moment where we face the choice of, okay, what am I going to read now? How am I going to fill my time? How am I going to fill my mind? What choice will I make? And it made this quote from Metropolitan Anthony Bloom popped up on like the Y2AM social media this week, I think, which made me think of this. So he says, we should try to live in such a way that if the Gospels were lost, they could be rewritten by looking at us. So we should try to live in such a way that if there were no Gospels, people would be like, that is the way to live. That is the way to love your neighbor. That is the way to love God. Like look at how that person conducts their life. This is what we should be doing. But this goes hand in hand with Oscar Wilde because he's telling us that when you make choices of reading, when you sit down and decide, okay, this is what I'm going to read, not because I have to read it for church, not because I'm sitting in church right now, not because I'm on some like Lenten reading plan or something that my priest put in the bulletin. Like when you make the choice to read yourself, to sit down and open the Bible, that's when you start to absorb it more because you have ownership over it, right? Like this is how I teach kids how to read too. I'm like, look, you can read whatever you want as long as you're reading. And as soon as they take ownership of their reading, they become much more engaged and invested in what they're reading. So if we truly want to live out this quote that we've heard said multiple ways and multiple times about how you should be living the gospel in such a way that even if someone had never read the gospel, never heard of the gospel, they would know that was the gospel, then you need to be making the choices to read and let that reading come into you when it's your choice, when you have ownership and decide to do it. And this is hard to do because like I said, the Bible is like kind of overwhelming and confusing and sometimes depressing and big and you're like, where do I even start? And that's why the choice comes in even more. No one's telling you like, oh, you have to read Deuteronomy. No, start with what you like. Like if you know the Psalms and they are the most approachable and you've even heard them before, still sit down and read them because taking that ownership of reading the Psalms yourself on your own time, not when anyone's telling you to, is going to make all the difference. Okay, so we've talked about reading, we've talked about good books, what makes a book good. And the last piece of this maxim is a little at a time. So this can also be challenging because if you already are an avid reader, you might like to sit down and read for hours upon hours upon hours, which I very much enjoy. But as with all things in our faith, we want to do things in moderation, right? We don't want to overwhelm ourselves with something, especially if we're taking on such a daunting task as reading the Bible, right? You're not going to sit down and read like 6 chapters in one night. Like give yourself some grace. The same thing with books, because you need time to think, you need time to process. We hear so much about how we should be spending time in silence. So by doing these things slowly, it gives us the space and the room to allow it to wash over us. So St. Paisios talks about this. He says, as a novice, when I read something I liked, I wrote it down so as not to forget it, and I would try to apply it to my life. I didn't read just to pass my time pleasantly. I had a spiritual restlessness, and when I could not understand something, I would ask for an explanation. I read relatively little, but I checked myself a great deal on what I read. What point am I at? What must I do? I would sit myself down and go through such a self-examination. So when I talk to my kids about reading, I tell them they need to think about their thinking. So when you're reading, you're not only reading what's in front of you, you're also tuned into what you're thinking about while you're reading. And this is that self-examination that St. Paisios is talking about. So his method is that he writes things down when he read something that he likes. He makes an actual physical note of it. And that way he has it in front of him and he can apply it to his life. For me, I have had moments in my life where I've been going through something and I've heard like a line from literature in my head that relates to the moment, because I've taken time to like sit and marinate and think about what is being said in the book, I then find it popping up into my brain when I'm faced in maybe a similar situation or a relevant situation. So we want to take time to appreciate the writing and the prose, but also the ideas and thoughts that we come across in these books, whether we agree with them, disagree with them, find them confusing, find them interesting. It's good to stop while you're reading and think about your thinking. Think about what you're thinking about the book. And then how it can apply to your own life. Because if we've chosen our books intentionally, if we're reading these good books that are pleasing to God, given to us by God and bringing us closer to God, then it's not enough to just read it and be able to retell it. You have to apply it to your life. What nuggets of wisdom can you take out of these books and thus manifest in your own life? So as St. Paisios is saying, I didn't just read to pass my time pleasantly. While reading is a pleasant experience, it also can be a spiritually beneficial one. And then I really like what he says kind of in the middle here, where he says, like, if I couldn't understand something, I would ask for an explanation, right? So sometimes we might come across things in books that we are confused by, that we don't agree with, that we think like, how could someone think this is true or right or real? And that's okay. It's okay to read a book and be like, I don't like this. This doesn't sit well with me. What is this saying about the world that I live in, that someone would write something like this? And that's when you want to engage in that struggle, right? Go to someone that you trust, a friend, a spiritual father, someone in your OCF chapter, and say like, I read this and I don't know what to think about it, or I don't like it. It doesn't feel good. Ask for that explanation, because a reading is somewhat of a risk, right? You're engaging with ideas that are not your own. You're engaging with ideas outside your comfort zone, hopefully. So you're gonna come across things that you're gonna have to tangle with. And it's important to tangle with them. Out of that struggle will come understanding and joy and knowledge. But find someone that you can trust or rely on to talk about it with. Reading is an independent activity, but it's also a communal activity. That's why we have book clubs and things like that where we talk about books. It's something we do on our own, but it's something we sort of process together. So it's important then that we note what we're reading. We write down what we notice, what stands out to us. We ask questions about what we're reading, and then we get answers to those questions. So St. Paisios, who we know is a very wise and holy man, he says, I read relatively little, right? He wasn't, like, he's admitting that maybe he's not even the most well-read person on the planet, but he's checking himself on what he's reading. He's processing what he's reading. He's probably, I'm gonna guess, intentional about what he's reading, and thus using it to inform his spiritual life. So using it to reflect on himself. What point am I at? What must I do? How is this going to propel me forward in my spiritual journey? So he ends, the quote goes on for a while, but in the end, he says, the goal, however, is to be transformed in a God-centered man. And of course, isn't that all of our goals at the end? To become more Christ-centered, to become more God-centered. And reading is one of the ways that we can do that, by picking books that are good, are pleasing, are holy, are given to us by God, and thus in some way teach us something, make us question something, make us wonder about something that then leads us on the path to salvation and closer to Christ.